Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. It is the year 1913, and Times Square glows with electric light. Crowds move across the pavement. Horse-drawn wagons mix with the growing hum of automobiles. And on the corner, a small bronze marker quietly announces something almost unthinkable. From this very place, a road begins. A road that will carry the dream of America all the way to the Pacific Ocean. They called it the Lincoln Highway. It stretched from New York to San Francisco, more than 3,000 miles across plains, deserts, and mountains. It promised that ordinary people, not just the wealthy, could take a car and see their country from end to end. Before Route 66 became a household name, before the interstate system carved its straight lines across the map, there was this forgotten road, the first true transcontinental highway in American history. And yet, if it changed everything, why is it so rarely remembered? Why do so few travelers today know that before the Mother Road, there was another, a road that stitched together 14 states, inspired the birth of motels and roadside diners, and gave birth to the very idea of the American road trip? Tonight, on Sleepytown Radio, we will retrace that journey. We will step back into an era when a highway might be no more than a dusty track, when families camped beside their Model Ts under endless skies, and when towns painted their walls with bold letters begging, "See us via the Lincoln Highway, settle in." Let the hum of memory replace the rush of the present. This is not just a story about pavement and paint. It is a story about a nation discovering itself mile by mile, and so the road awaits. At the turn of the 20th century, America was vast but strangely disconnected. Towns were scattered like islands across a sea of farmland and wilderness, and between them lay little more than dirt tracks, rutted wagon trails, and mud that could swallow a wheel whole. To imagine driving from New York to San Francisco in those years was less a plan and more a dream, one dismissed by most as folly. Railroads ruled long-distance travel. If you wanted to go coast to coast, you boarded a train, sitting in a car of polished wood and steel, watching the country pass in blur outside your window. It was efficient for its time, even glamorous in certain ways, but it was not personal. You could not stop when you pleased. You could not linger in a quiet town or pull to the side of the road to watch the sunset settle over the plains. The rails carried you swiftly, but at their own pace, along a line chosen long before you bought your ticket. For goods, too, the options were limited. Freight wagons still rolled across short distances, their wooden wheels creaking against the earth, pulled by horses that tired quickly on muddy paths. Shipping companies made do with a patchwork of routes. Sometimes a crate might start its journey in a wagon, be loaded onto a train, and then carried again by animal teams across some impassable stretch. The system worked well enough to keep the nation supplied, but it left no room for the kind of freedom the motor car hinted was possible, because to own an automobile in those days was to imagine independence. With your own engine, you could, in theory, choose your direction and your schedule. You could travel on your own terms. But in practice, a motorist faced endless obstacles. Beyond city limits, paved surfaces simply disappeared. A road might begin in cobblestone near a courthouse or church, but within a mile, it dissolved into ruts cut deep by wagon wheels. Rain turned those ruts into rivers of mud, where cars sank axle deep and sometimes had to be hauled out by teams of mules. In dry seasons, the same paths became dust clouds, choking engines and blinding travelers. There were no uniform maps. Each region kept its own guides, if any at all, and many were little more than sketches on paper sold by local printers. Road signs were rare, and the few that existed were often hand-painted and inconsistent. A traveler might follow a marker nailed to a fence post, only to discover it led to a dead end. To set out across America by car meant risking not only breakdowns, but also the very real chance of becoming lost in the wide, unmarked spaces between towns. Bridges were scarce, too. Rivers were either forded when shallow, or else crossed by ferries that ran on no fixed schedule. In some rural places, motorists resorted to driving across railroad bridges, waiting for trains to pass and then carefully easing their vehicles across the ties. It was dangerous, but it was sometimes the only way forward. Imagine the courage it took. Families packing their belongings, or young men daring to test their machines on such treacherous ground. The automobile was still a new invention, temperamental and prone to breakdowns. Tires punctured easily, radiators overheated, and spare parts were rare outside major cities. Mechanics were few and far between. Often, a farmer with a set of tools became the only hope of getting a stranded motorist moving again. In those early years, long-distance driving was less about speed and more about determination. To attempt a trip of even a few hundred miles required grit, patience, and a willingness to improvise at every turn. A coast-to-coast journey by car in 1912 was almost unthinkable. The roads were not ready. The country itself was not ready. And yet, in that gap between what was possible and what was imagined, a dream began to take root. The dream that America could be stitched together, not by rails, but by roads. It is here, in this landscape of mud tracks and unmarked fields, that the story of the Lincoln Highway truly begins. Long before the Lincoln Highway was even imagined, before the notion of a true national road had taken shape, there were the clubs. Small, determined groups of men and women who loved their machines enough to carve a path for them where no path really existed. In those early years of the 20th century, an automobile was not just transportation. It was an experiment, a daring leap into the future. To own one was to accept that every journey might break down into a puzzle of gears and grease. And so, car owners began to band together. They formed associations and local automobile clubs, not only to share advice or boast of speed, but to make the roads themselves passable. Imagine them on a Sunday morning, gathering at the edge of town, drivers in goggles and caps, women wrapped in scarves against the dust. They would set out with brushes and buckets of paint, marking poles and trees to guide one another through the countryside. A band of red, a stripe of white, a touch of blue. Simple marks, but to a motorist, they were lifelines. For a traveler leaving the city, those painted bands offered the only assurance that he was still on the right road. The next town might be 30 miles away, and without such signs, a single wrong turn could mean hours lost in a maze of farm lanes. These little strokes of color were promises. You are not alone. Keep going. The road is still ahead of you. The clubs did more than paint. They printed their own maps, sometimes little more than folded sheets handed out at meetings. The directions were often charmingly imprecise. Turn left at the big oak tree, or follow the fence line until you reach the red barn. Yet, for the motorists of the day, those rough guides meant freedom. They transformed a wilderness of dirt and dust into something like a road system, even if only held together by goodwill and ink on paper. There was also a spirit of hospitality in those days. Clubs stationed volunteers along the worst stretches of road, men with shovels who cleared mud or filled holes just to keep the way open. In some places, if a traveler became stranded, it was a fellow club member, someone he had never met, who would appear with a tow rope or a patch kit and see him safely on his way again. And so, while the nation as a whole had no plan for its roads, small communities built their own patchwork solutions. Each trail had its supporters, its advocates who wanted their town to be seen, their route to be traveled. Some trails carried ambitious names: the Yellowstone Trail, the Dixie Highway, the Ocean-to-Ocean Route. Each was promoted by a club or association, each with its painted symbols and hand-drawn maps. Yet for all their energy, these trails did not connect into a single whole. They overlapped, they contradicted, and they left wide gaps where motorists fended for themselves. What existed was not yet a highway system, but a hopeful sketch of one, a patchwork quilt laid across the continent, waiting for someone with vision to stitch it together. Still, those painted poles mattered. To early motorists, they were signs of belonging. They said, "You are part of something larger than yourself." Every brushstroke along the roadside hinted that the dream of a unified road was possible, that perhaps someday you might drive not just to the next town, but across the entire country, guided by clear signs and steady pavement. And it was from this fragile, colorful network of painted bands and volunteer maps that the idea of the Lincoln Highway would eventually be born. Out of the clubs, out of the paint, out of the goodwill of strangers, the seed was planted for the first true American road. In the years before the Lincoln Highway, driving across America was a fantasy whispered more than it was attempted. The roads were too rough, the distances too great, and the automobiles too fragile. But then, in 1908, a single machine rolled out of a Detroit factory and quietly began to change the story. It was called the Model T. Henry Ford had designed it not for the wealthy, but for ordinary families. It was simple, rugged, and, most importantly, affordable. For the first time, a farmer, a shopkeeper, even a schoolteacher could imagine owning a car of their own. By 1912, the price had dropped to less than $700, and by the late teens it would fall even further. The Model T was not elegant. It rattled, it bounced, and it sputtered along at speeds that today would seem laughably slow. But it was reliable in a way that mattered more than speed. It could be repaired with simple tools, coaxed back to life by anyone willing to get their hands dirty. Spare parts could be carried in a box, and most fixes could be done at the roadside. In a country where mechanics were few, that self-sufficiency was a revelation, and so, almost overnight, America filled with motorists. Families packed their belongings into the back of these humble machines and set off down dusty tracks. Young couples took Sunday drives beyond the town limits. Farmers used them to haul milk or seed, bouncing across fields where only horses had gone before. The Model T gave ordinary people the power to move farther, faster, and more freely than ever before. But with that freedom came pressure. The roads, once ignored, were now crowded with rattling caravans of Model Ts. What had once been a muddy trail to the next village suddenly became a vital connection for commerce and family. People began to demand something more permanent, more dependable. They wanted roads that did not vanish in the rain, roads that could link city to city, state to state. The Model T, in its unassuming way, forced the nation to confront its own lack of infrastructure. Because for every cheerful family bouncing along a country lane, there were just as many who found themselves stuck axle-deep in mud, waiting hours for help. For every triumphant ride into the next town, there was a story of a broken wheel or a ruined tire. These frustrations did not kill the dream of the open road. They only sharpened it. It was as if the automobile revealed a hunger that had always been there. Americans longed to see their own country, not from the window of a train, but from the driver's seat. They wanted to stop at a farmhouse for pie, to watch the Rockies rise slowly on the horizon, to dip their hands into rivers they had only read about. The Model T placed that dream within reach, but the roads themselves lagged behind, and so the call for something greater grew louder. Clubs and communities began to imagine what a true highway might mean, a hard-surfaced path stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. A road not just for the wealthy or the adventurous, but for everyone with a car. It was a bold vision, and yet, by the early 1910s, it felt inevitable. Too many Americans now owned automobiles to accept that their world would remain hemmed in by mud and dust. The Model T had opened the door, and once opened, it could not be shut. It was in this atmosphere of change, of frustration, but also of boundless hope, that the dream of the Lincoln Highway took shape. A dream not born in marble halls of government, but in the hearts of ordinary people who wanted what their cars had promised them, the freedom of the open road. Every great road begins with a dreamer, and for the Lincoln Highway, that dreamer was Carl Graham Fisher. Fisher's story reads like something out of a restless American novel. Once a bicycle racer, then a dealer, and later a daring entrepreneur in the infant automobile industry, he carried with him the energy of a man who never accepted limits. He had already helped build speedways, promoted motor racing, and sold headlamps for cars when most Americans had barely seen one. But his grandest idea was not a product to sell. It was a vision to reshape the nation itself. By 1912, Fisher had grown frustrated by the chaos of America's roads. He knew the Model T had changed everything. Ordinary families were ready to travel, but the nation had no reliable path to carry them. Railroads dominated the map, while the highways that did exist were little more than fragments. He began to imagine something no one else dared, a single hard-surfaced road stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. At first, he called it the Rock Highway, named for the crushed stone and cement he believed should form its base. But Fisher was as much a showman as he was a builder, and he soon realized that the name lacked poetry. If he wanted America to embrace this dream, it would need a symbol as timeless as the road itself. And so, he turned to the figure of Abraham Lincoln, Lincoln's name carried weight in every corner of the country. He was the president who had held the Union together, a man whose memory was revered not just in statues or speeches, but in the hearts of everyday Americans. By calling his project the Lincoln Highway, Fisher gave it a patriotic soul. This was not just a strip of pavement. It was to be a living memorial, a road that would unite the nation once again, this time through the freedom of travel. "Let's build it," Fisher declared, "before we're too old to enjoy it." His words were less an argument than a challenge, spoken with the impatience of a man who wanted the future to arrive immediately. And he was not speaking only to politicians. Fisher believed the government was too slow, too hesitant. Instead, he turned to the very industry that would benefit most: automobile manufacturers, tire companies, cement producers, and parts suppliers. He asked them to contribute, not just money, but belief in an idea bigger than themselves. The proposal was radical for its time. America had never seen a privately promoted highway on such a scale. To skeptics, it sounded like folly. To dreamers, it was irresistible. In Fisher's hands, the Lincoln Highway was marketed not as infrastructure, but as destiny. Newspaper articles, speeches, and club meetings all repeated the vision. A road from Times Square to Lincoln Park in San Francisco. More than 3,000 miles of promise. It is worth pausing here, in the soft glow of hindsight, to imagine what this must have felt like. Picture a country where most people had never traveled more than a few hundred miles from home. Picture a family reading about this road in the newspaper, wondering if someday they might load their Model T and set out toward mountains and deserts they had only seen in photographs. The idea was thrilling, intoxicating, and it was Fisher's genius to give that thrill a focus. Not a vague dream of better roads, but one specific highway with a beginning, a middle, and an end. A road that would one day carry soldiers, farmers, musicians, salesmen, and families across the continent. A road that would make the vastness of America feel just a little smaller, a little more connected. The Lincoln Highway had not yet been built, but in Carl Fisher's imagination, and soon in the imagination of millions, it already existed. Dreams as bold as Carl Fisher's rarely come easily. His vision of a coast-to-coast highway, hard-surfaced, enduring, patriotic in spirit, was breathtaking. But once the speeches were finished and the excitement had faded, one question remained: who would pay for it? Fisher did not turn first to Washington. He believed the federal government moved too slowly, tangled in politics and indecision. Instead, he appealed directly to the rising automobile industry, the makers of cars, tires, cement, and gasoline. After all, these companies would benefit most from a road that encouraged Americans to drive farther and more often. He asked them to pledge contributions, large and small, until they reached an ambitious goal: $10 million. At first, the idea caught fire. Newspapers praised the audacity. Within weeks, Fisher secured pledges totaling more than $1 million. The Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company committed a remarkable sum of $300,000. Packard Motor Cars added $150,000 more. Cement companies, local dealers, and even small garages sent what they could. It seemed as if the nation's business leaders were ready to invest in this grand experiment, and yet A shadow hung over the effort. The largest figure in the American auto world, Henry Ford, refused. His Model T had put the country on wheels, but Ford would not put his name or his dollars behind the Lincoln Highway. In his mind, roads were the responsibility of the public. They should be built with taxpayer funds, not private campaigns. To him, Fisher's vision was not noble. It was misguided. Ford's rejection nearly broke the momentum. Other manufacturers hesitated. If the most powerful man in the industry would not lend his support, why should they? Letters were written, calls were made, and even influential friends like Thomas Edison tried to persuade Ford, but he held firm, unmoved. The silence of his refusal threatened to derail the project before it could truly begin. Still, Fisher pressed on. He had never been a man to surrender when faced with doubt. He traveled the country, speaking before civic clubs and chambers of commerce. He told audiences that the Lincoln Highway was more than concrete and gravel. It was a memorial to Abraham Lincoln, a gift to the future, and a road that would unite towns large and small. His words carried a spark that inspired people to open their wallets, and more importantly, their imaginations. Gradually, the pledges grew again. Money flowed in from those who saw the highway not just as an expense, but as an investment in progress. Tire companies imagined their brands rolling across the continent. Cement firms envisioned their product poured mile after mile. Small towns dreamed of travelers filling their hotels and buying meals at their cafes. By 1913, enough momentum had gathered to make the idea official. The Lincoln Highway Association was formed in Detroit, with Fisher at its heart. It was a curious organization, part publicity campaign, part construction office, part patriotic crusade. Its leaders promised the American people that within a year, there would be a continuous road stretching from Times Square in New York to Lincoln Park in San Francisco. It is easy now, from the quiet of hindsight, to underestimate how radical this promise was. No one had ever attempted to chart, mark, and promote such a road before. No one had dared to raise millions of private dollars for something most believed was the duty of government. And yet, the dream held, even in its uncertain beginnings, shaken by doubt, opposed by giants. The Lincoln Highway began to take on a life of its own. It was no longer just Carl Fisher's vision. It was becoming America's. Carl Fisher had given the Lincoln Highway its spark, but every vision needs a steady hand to turn it from dream to reality. That hand belonged to Henry Bourne Joy, the president of Packard Motor Car Company, and a man whose name fit his character. Where Fisher was bold, restless, and full of showmanship, Joy was disciplined and deliberate. He had already proven himself in the automobile world, building Packard into a symbol of luxury and precision. But beyond business, he carried something deeper, a conviction that roads could do more than move machines. They could unite a nation. Joy stepped into the Lincoln Highway project with an energy that surprised even his closest peers. He was not content to sit in meetings or sign his name to pledges. He financed press campaigns, traveled to investigate potential routes, and pressed state officials to lend support. He worked tirelessly to convince both the public and the private sector that the Lincoln Highway was not just a good idea, but a necessary one. Under his influence, the Lincoln Highway Association became more than a fundraising committee. It became an organization with structure, discipline, and a patriotic message. Their headquarters in Detroit buzzed like a startup long before such a word existed. Staff prepared maps, drafted press releases, and coordinated with local clubs across 14 states. They spoke not in terms of profits, but in terms of progress, of opportunity, unity, and pride. Joy insisted that the highway be framed as a living memorial to Abraham Lincoln. Statues were fine, he argued, but the truest monument would be something that touched everyday life. A road stretching from coast to coast would not simply remind Americans of Lincoln's sacrifice. It would carry them forward into a future he had fought to preserve. This patriotic branding resonated deeply. Newspapers embraced the message, running stories that cast the Lincoln Highway not only as a feat of engineering, but as a tribute to national character. Families began to dream of traveling its length, seeing their country mile by mile. Towns along the proposed route lobbied fiercely, hoping to be included, knowing that a place on the highway meant visitors, commerce, and prestige. Joy's own words captured the heart of the project. He believed the Lincoln Highway would be a chain uniting the East and the West, binding communities and states into a common destiny. For him, the road was not only concrete and gravel, it was vision made visible. Of course, the work was anything but simple. At this point, many states did not even have proper highway commissions. Budgets were slim, equipment was limited, and standards varied wildly. Yet the association pressed forward, drafting guides, planning ceremonies, and constantly reminding the public that this was not a government project. It was a people's project, fueled by shared effort and shared pride. It is easy, here in the quiet of memory, to picture Joy at his desk in Detroit, pen in hand, correspondence stacked high, letters from farmers, businessmen, civic leaders, all weighing in, all wanting their piece of the future. He must have sensed the enormity of it, that this road would not just change how people traveled, but how they thought about distance, about connection, about their own place in the country. If Fisher was the dreamer who lit the torch, Joy was the steady flame that kept it burning. His far-sighted discipline and tireless work gave the Lincoln Highway legitimacy. And through him, the association became not just a group of enthusiasts, but the guiding force that would transform a bold idea into a true national milestone. For all the speeches, the pledges, and the patriotic words, the Lincoln Highway still faced its greatest challenge. No one yet knew exactly where it would go. America in 1913 was not a land of uniform highways. It was a patchwork of wagon trails, farm lanes, and dusty paths. To create a road that would run unbroken from New York to San Francisco required something as bold as the dream itself, men willing to drive into the unknown and mark a way forward, mile by mile. The task fell to the association's field secretaries, adventurers in their own right, equipped with clipboards, cameras, and automobiles that rattled as much as they rolled. Among the most dedicated was Henry C. Osterman, a man whose name is still whispered with respect among highway historians. He logged more than 250,000 miles scouting routes, crossing rivers, deserts, and mountains that had barely seen an automobile. Imagine him bumping down a muddy track in rural Iowa, dust in his teeth, the map on his lap already outdated by the time the ink dried. His job was not glamorous. He was to record road conditions, measure distances, and note every hazard. A washed-out bridge, a deep rut, a hostile farmer unwilling to let the road cut across his land. His notes filled page after page, the bones upon which the Lincoln Highway would be built. The association had a guiding principle, one Osterman repeated often: the road goes where it's welcomed. In practice, this meant that towns eager for inclusion painted signs, lobbied officials, and sometimes offered free labor or land. Communities along the way saw the highway not only as a convenience, but as a lifeline, bringing travelers, commerce, and prestige. To be bypassed was to risk being forgotten, and yet, not every town greeted the scouts with open arms. Some resented the noise of automobiles, the dust clouds that rolled in behind them, and the thought of outsiders rumbling through quiet streets. In such places, Osterman and his colleagues simply moved on. The Lincoln Highway would not force itself upon the unwilling. It would find those who believed in its promise and link them together like beads on a string. The work was exhausting. Scouts faced axle-deep mud in Ohio, brutal winds in Nebraska, and the barren salt flats of Utah where the horizon shimmered endlessly and landmarks were few. In the West, bridges were rare, and crossing a river sometimes meant waiting hours for a ferry or risking the ford. Out in Nevada, the road was little more than parallel lines in the sand, easily lost in a gust of desert wind. Every mile was a question mark, every turn a decision that could shape the life of a town for decades to come. Despite the hardship, there was also wonder. Scouts saw landscapes most Americans knew only from postcards: rolling Pennsylvania hills, the vast plains of Illinois, the snow-tipped peaks of the Rockies. They camped under stars so sharp they seemed to hum, their cars cooling beside them like tired animals. They were pioneers, not of the frontier, but of the motor age, charting a new America, one dusty track at a time. From their reports, maps began to take shape. Lines were drawn, routes revised, adjustments made. The first sketches of the Lincoln Highway were not neat or simple. They were compromises, stitched together from what was possible rather than what was ideal. But they were a beginning, and so, before a single barrel of cement was poured, before a single signpost was painted, the Lincoln Highway existed on paper and in the hearts of those who had driven its bones. It was raw, uncertain, and unfinished. Yet in the roar of an early engine and the scribble of a pencil on a notebook, the first true transcontinental highway of America slowly found its path through the unknown. Dreams on paper are fragile things. They shimmer in the imagination, but to make them real, someone has to lift the shovel, haul the stone, and pour the cement. For the Lincoln Highway, that meant transforming thousands of miles of uneven trails into something that could carry automobiles safely across a continent. It was back-breaking work. In the first decade alone, more than 700,000 barrels of cement were used. Sand and gravel were dug from local pits, hauled by wagons or rail, then mixed and poured mile by mile. In Indiana, one stretch known as the Ideal Section became a showcase of what modern road building could be. That single mile consumed 11,000 barrels of cement, more than 10,000 tons of crushed stone, and miles of drainage tile, all laid by hand and horse-drawn machinery. For motorists passing through, it was a glimpse of the future. Smooth, durable, and built to last. But most of the highway did not begin with such perfection. In Iowa and Illinois, road crews worked with little mechanization. Farmers left their fields to haul rock with wagons. County supervisors hired day laborers to grade the earth, spreading gravel under the summer sun. In Nevada, the state turned to its prison population, sending inmates to lay roadbeds across the desert, mile after mile, under watchful eyes. The work was slow, gritty, and dangerous, but it stitched together places that had never been connected before. In some towns, the Lincoln Highway Association delivered the materials, but the community itself provided the labor. Volunteers, merchants, farmers, students gathered to pour concrete, believing that each foot of road would bring travelers and opportunity closer. For them, the highway was not just a thoroughfare. It was hope, hardening into stone. Everywhere, improvisation ruled. Drainage ditches were dug by hand, often with nothing more than shovels. Curbs and guardrails appeared in the more ambitious sections, reminders that this was not merely a dirt track. It was meant to be a model of modern engineering. Yet in rural Wyoming or Nevada, the work could be as primitive as filling ruts with rocks scavenged from nearby hills. The laborers faced heat, storms, and isolation. In the open plains, the wind whipped dust into their eyes until they could hardly see the line of road they were grading. In the mountains, sudden rains washed out work that had taken weeks to build. And in the deserts, the silence pressed in heavy, broken only by the scrape of shovels and the rattle of wagons. Still, there was a sense of pride. To build the Lincoln Highway was to take part in something larger than oneself. It meant being written into the story of progress. Men who laid stone in Illinois, or poured cement in Indiana, or graded gravel in Utah, knew that they were leaving behind something permanent, something that would carry strangers long after they themselves were gone. Not all of it was smooth or standardized. In some places, the highway looked almost like a patchwork quilt, 1 mile gleaming with new concrete, the next reverting to rough gravel, the one after that a simple dirt path. But together, it was progress. Together, it was proof that the dream could take physical shape. By the time construction stretched from coast to coast, the Lincoln Highway had been built not by one hand, but by thousands, by convicts and contractors, by farmers and factorymen, by local crews and national companies. Each of them left sweat and stone in the earth, binding communities together mile by mile, and so, in the clatter of shovels, the grind of gravel, and the hiss of wet cement, a dream of connection became a reality. The Lincoln Highway was no longer only an idea. It was a road you could touch, a road you could drive, a road that carried the weight of a nation's hope. For all the effort poured into the Lincoln Highway, money raised, cement mixed, and labor endured, it was still easy for a traveler to lose their way. Roads in early 20th century America had no uniform signs, no numbered markers, no glowing green exit boards as we know today. A driver might leave a smooth stretch of pavement, roll into a maze of farm tracks, and wonder if the highway had simply vanished into the earth. The solution came not from grand engineering, but from something far simpler: paint and letters. In 1915, the Lincoln Highway Association introduced a system of markings that would guide motorists across the continent. Volunteers and local clubs, sometimes entire families, took brushes dipped in red, white, and blue paint and walked from pole to pole. On telephone posts, fence rails, and even the sides of barns, they painted a large, blocky L framed in the colors of the flag. It was modest, but to travelers it felt like magic. Imagine driving across Ohio or Nebraska, the sun setting and dust curling behind your wheels. You come to a fork in the road, one track leading north, the other veering west. There are no signs, no maps you can trust, but then you spot it. A bright letter L painted on a pole, its stripes still fresh from a volunteer's brush. Relief settles in your chest. You know you're still on the Lincoln Highway. These painted letters stitch the road together as surely as the concrete and gravel did. They turned an uncertain route into something people could follow with confidence. Families learned to look for them as children in the back seat shouted, "There's the L!" Townspeople treated them with reverence, repainting them when they faded, guarding them from vandals. In many places, the sign was the first visible evidence that the great national highway had truly arrived, and the L was more than a direction. It was a promise that you belonged to something bigger than your own dusty county road. A promise that if you followed faithfully, the same markings would carry you all the way to New York or San Francisco. The red, white, and blue bands gave each journey a patriotic air, reminding travelers that this was not just any road, but one named for Abraham Lincoln himself. Some communities went further, erecting wooden signboards or even concrete markers with bronze medallions. Others painted murals across buildings, shouting proudly, "See us via the Lincoln Highway." The road was both a path and a brand, and its painted symbols worked like an early advertisement campaign. One not just selling cars or tires, but selling the romance of the open road itself. It is moving now to imagine those volunteers in 1915. Ordinary men and women, teenagers with paint buckets, elderly farmers leaning on brushes, all taking part in a national ritual. With each stroke of color on a wooden pole, they made the highway more real. Their work required no heavy machinery, no grand expense, only belief in the road and a willingness to guide strangers they would never meet. By the summer of that year, the Lincoln Highway could be traced from end to end by its painted signs. Travelers spoke of it with wonder. A road you could actually follow, a road marked clearly enough to cross a continent. And so, before the roar of trucks and the glitter of neon signs, before Route 66 or the interstates, America's first true coast-to-coast road announced itself humbly with painted letters on old wooden poles. A small L in red, white, and blue, guiding dreamers westward, one sign at a time. By the middle of the 1910s, the Lincoln Highway was no longer just an idea on a map or a string of painted L's on telephone poles. It had become something people could experience firsthand, and those who set out to drive it found themselves part of an adventure unlike anything America had ever known. A cross-country trip in those days was no weekend jaunt. To cover the more than 3,000 miles between New York and San Francisco could take 20 to 30 days, sometimes longer. Speeds averaged between 18 and 20 miles per hour, and only on the smoothest stretches could a motorist push faster. 1 mile might glide beneath the wheels on fresh concrete, while the next turned into loose gravel, and the one after that dissolved into rutted mud. Each day was a patchwork of surfaces, conditions, and surprises. Drivers carried shovels and planks to dig themselves out of axle-deep mire. Extra tires were strapped to the sides of cars like lifeboats because blowouts were almost inevitable. Engines overheated, radiators boiled over, and more than one family could be found by the roadside, coats laid out in the dust as they waited for the motor to cool. Livestock wandered freely across the highway, cows, horses, and even flocks of sheep, forcing sudden halts that left city drivers bewildered. And yet, despite the hardship, there was a thrill in simply being there. Imagine a family of 4 in a Model T, the back piled with bedrolls and tins of food. The father behind the wheel, hands clenched as he steered through the ruts. The mother beside him, unfolding the association's guidebook, calling out turn-by-turn directions that sometimes led them straight into a pasture. In the back, children craned their necks out of the windows, cheering whenever they spotted the painted L on a fence post. For them, this was adventure, freedom, and discovery all rolled into one. Nights on the highway carried their own rhythm. At first, families simply camped by the roadside, sleeping in cars or pitching tents on nearby fields. They cooked over open fires, the smell of bacon or coffee drifting into the night air. Gradually, as the traffic increased, auto camps appeared, rudimentary facilities where travelers could rest, share stories, and prepare for the next day's journey. These camps would evolve into motels, diners, and filling stations, planting the seeds of a roadside culture that became as iconic as the road itself. Life on the Lincoln Highway was not just about endurance. It was about connection. In small towns across Pennsylvania, Ohio, Nebraska, and Wyoming, locals waved as cars rolled past. Children gathered to stare at these machines that seemed almost magical. Merchants sold food and fuel, blacksmiths turned into mechanics, and farmers struck up conversations with strangers from cities they would never visit. To travel the Lincoln Highway was to be part of something bigger than a single trip. Each bump, each detour, each flat tire was part of the collective story of a nation learning to live with the automobile. For those who endured the jolts and the dust, there was also a sense of privilege. They were pioneers, carving memories into a brand new kind of frontier. And at the end of each day, as the car slowed and the sun dipped below the horizon, travelers felt a quiet satisfaction. The Lincoln Highway might have been rough, uneven, and unpredictable, but it was theirs to conquer. In the soft crackle of campfires, in the laughter of children tucked into blankets in the back seat, and in the steady hum of engines cooling under the stars, the road revealed its true gift. Not speed, not convenience, but the simple joy of moving forward, together, across the vast expanse of America. As the Lincoln Highway stretched its way across the American landscape, it did more than connect cities and states. It began to connect livelihoods. Out of its dust and concrete rose an economy that had never existed before. A roadside world that turned quiet crossroads into bustling stops and sleepy farm towns into gateways for travelers. In the earliest days, there were no gas stations in the modern sense. Motorists carried fuel in 5-gallon cans strapped to the running boards, and they were grateful when a general store happened to sell gasoline alongside flour and sugar. But soon, the steady trickle of automobiles created new opportunity. Enterprising shopkeepers cleared space for pumps out front. Blacksmiths, who had once shod horses, learned to repair carburetors and patch inner tubes. Families set up small stalls selling sandwiches, pies, and jars of water to weary travelers. The Lincoln Highway was more than a route. It was a chance. Towns competed fiercely for the honor of being on the alignment. Local officials painted bold slogans across barns and storefronts. "See us via the Lincoln Highway." Communities knew that a road passing through could mean the difference between decline and prosperity. One town might struggle in obscurity, bypassed by the surveyors, while the next, blessed with a painted L on its telephone poles, found itself suddenly alive with strangers, trade, and hope. Auto camps grew in open fields where travelers pitched tents. For a modest fee, they were offered a water pump, a cooking pit, and sometimes even a wooden shelter. These humble sites were the seed of something far larger: the roadside motel. By the 1920s, a new kind of hospitality had taken root. Places built not near train depots or town squares, but right along the highway itself. Soon came diners with gleaming counters, filling stations with bright neon signs, and tourist cabins arranged in neat rows. For the first time, the road itself became a destination. Families might stop not because they had reached their city, but because a diner's aroma beckoned, or because a billboard promised a comfortable night's sleep just a few miles ahead. A rhythm of stopping, resting, and spending developed, one that would eventually define the great American road trip. This economy also carried with it a deep sense of pride. Small towns felt tethered to something greater, part of a chain that stretched from Times Square to the Pacific. A farmer's wife baking pies for travelers in Iowa, a mechanic in Ohio adjusting an engine late at night, a teenager pumping gas under the hot Wyoming sun. All of them became threads in the fabric of a new roadside America. Their work wasn't glamorous, but it kept the wheels turning and the journeys alive. The roadside economy was also about human connection. Travelers, tired and dusty, would trade stories with locals over cups of coffee. Children marveled at license plates from faraway states. A family from Nebraska might hear a song from New Jersey, sung by a stranger passing through. In these moments, the Lincoln Highway was more than pavement. It was a meeting place where cultures, dialects, and dreams mingled at a wooden counter or around a campfire. And though the great interstates would later refine and streamline this way of life, the DNA of the American roadside was born here, in these makeshift camps, hand-painted signs, and bustling diners. The Lincoln Highway was never only about getting somewhere faster. It was about what sprang up along the way. Gas pumps glowing at twilight, the smell of pie cooling on a counter, the laughter of children racing in and out of cabins. It was, at heart, about the people who built lives from the passing flow of travelers. And in their work, they built something larger still, the dream of a road that not only carried Americans across the land, but also sustained the very communities that lined its path. For all its mud, its ruts, and its bone-rattling jolts, the Lincoln Highway carried with it something electric, something that caught the imagination of an entire nation, the spirit of adventure. Americans had long been fed on tales of the frontier, of wagon trains and cowboys, of deserts that stretched forever, and mountains that scraped the sky. By the 1910s and 1920s, those images still flickered in the popular imagination. now magnified by the glow of the silver screen. Western films showed galloping horses, lone riders silhouetted against the horizon, and rugged landscapes that seemed both dangerous and irresistible. For a new generation, the automobile became their horse, and the Lincoln Highway, their trail into the unknown. Families who could spare the time and money packed themselves into Model Ts and Packards, their trunks filled with bedrolls, cooking pots, and boxes of food. They weren't merely traveling to see relatives or attend business. They were seeking something deeper, a taste of freedom, of discovery, of rolling out into the vast canvas of America. Mothers scribbled postcards from roadside camps. Fathers posed proudly beside the car with dust on their boots. Children leaned out the windows, wide-eyed at mountains, deserts, and endless skies they had only seen in books. For the middle class especially, the Lincoln Highway offered a kind of democratic adventure. You didn't need to be a millionaire to feel the thrill of crossing the Great Plains or to watch the sun set behind the Rockies. You just needed a car, some determination, and the willingness to endure a few breakdowns along the way. In a world where railroads had long dictated the routes of travel, the highway meant choice. It meant turning the wheel and deciding for yourself where the road would take you. The Lincoln Highway also carried commerce and labor, yes, but it carried dreams too. Young couples set out on honeymoons, believing that the road west symbolized their own journey into a shared future. College students piled into borrowed cars for summer adventures, laughing even as they changed tires in the mud. Small delivery trucks rumbled along the highway, their drivers as much explorers as businessmen, mapping out new trade routes with every mile. It was not without hardship. Engines overheated, tires blew, and storms turned dirt stretches into quagmires. But each obstacle only seemed to add to the romance. To overcome the land was to prove oneself. To make it from Times Square to San Francisco was to join a quiet fraternity of pioneers, a new breed who traded saddles for steering wheels. Newspapers picked up the stories. Magazines published photographs of dust-caked cars arriving triumphantly in California. And slowly, the Lincoln Highway became more than a means of travel. It became a symbol of possibility, of courage, and of the wide-open spaces that still waited to be discovered. And so, as families roasted marshmallows at auto camps, as children pointed at painted L signs, and as fathers steered through landscapes that seemed pulled from a motion picture reel, the highway wove itself into American memory. It was not just a road. It was an adventure, a promise, and a stage upon which ordinary men and women could feel, if only for a moment, like pioneers again. The Lincoln Highway gave Americans something priceless, not only a way forward, but a reason to go. For all its romance and promise, the Lincoln Highway could be merciless. The dream of gliding smoothly across America often collided with the harsher truth of early motoring. Those who set out on the road soon discovered that adventure came with trials that tested patience, skill, and sometimes courage. Bridges were rare, especially west of the Mississippi. Motorists often found themselves waiting for trains to pass before daring to edge their automobiles onto narrow trestles designed for locomotives, not cars. Imagine the nerves of a father steering his Model T across ties with the rails groaning under the wheels, his children silent in the back seat, staring into the drop below. One wrong turn of the steering wheel, and the dream of the open road might end in disaster. Mechanical troubles were constant companions. Tires blew out with sharp cracks, scattering rubber onto the dust. Engines overheated in the prairie sun, forcing travelers to stop, refill radiators with canteens of water, and wait for the metal to cool. Dust-choked carburetors. Mud sucked wheels down to the axles. At times, drivers and passengers alike waded barefoot into muck, pushing and straining until the car lurched free with a spray of mud across their clothes. The land itself threw up obstacles. Herds of cattle ambled onto the highway, unhurried and indifferent to the new machines honking at them. Sheep clogged mountain passes. On the open plains, sudden storms rolled in, turning dry stretches into rivers of clay. A road that had seemed passable in the morning could become impassable by afternoon, stranding travelers miles from the nearest town. Not all obstacles were natural. Some were man-made and deliberate. There were places where locals, resentful of the noise and dust, scattered nails across the road. Travelers told stories of waking to find their tires mysteriously punctured, or of being guided down shortcuts that led nowhere but deeper into mud. The Lincoln Highway was a path of hope, but it was also a road through human pride and frustration. Sleeping arrangements were often as rough as the road itself. When auto camps were still rare, many families bedded down in their cars, knees cramped, windows fogged with breath. Others pitched canvas tents beside fields, listening to the howl of coyotes or the rumble of trains in the distance. Fires crackled under coffee pots as mothers tried to cook meals in the wind, while children huddled in blankets, shivering against the cold. And yet, the hardships were not only physical, they were emotional. Every breakdown carried the weight of uncertainty. Every storm stirred fear. A father might worry he had led his family into danger. A mother might hide her unease behind calm words, steadying the children's nerves. But even in these moments, something remarkable happened. The road bound them together. Struggle became memory, and memory became story. In time, these hardships grew into part of the highway's legend. To have crossed the Lincoln Highway was to have endured. The flat tires, the sleepless nights, the dust and the mud, they became badges of honor, proof that the dream of the open road was not easily won. The Lincoln Highway was never a gentle journey. It demanded grit. It demanded resilience. But for those who pushed through, the hardships were not the end of the story. They were the heart of it, the tests that made the moments of triumph, of cresting a hill and seeing the horizon unbroken before you, all the more unforgettable. The Lincoln Highway, for all its ambition, was never a single uniform ribbon of pavement stretching cleanly from coast to coast. Instead, it was a mosaic, a patchwork stitched together from the roads, trails, and goodwill of countless towns and counties. Each state had its own standards, its own priorities, and its own limitations. And so, for travelers, every mile was a surprise. In Indiana, you might glide across the ideal section, a model stretch of concrete laid to demonstrate what a true modern highway could be. Straight, smooth, with wide shoulders and sturdy bridges. It felt almost futuristic, a taste of the road system America dreamed of building. But just a few hours later, you could find yourself bogged down in a rutted lane of dirt in Iowa, where rain turned the surface to sticky clay and forced motorists to wait for days until the ground hardened again. Nebraska offered long, flat stretches across the prairie, but there were places where the road was little more than a faint track through grassland, marked only by the painted L signs on telephone poles. In Wyoming, the highway wound past lonely ranches and mountain passes, some paved, others little more than wagon ruts. In Nevada, drivers crossed desert flats under a searing sun, praying their engines would not overheat, while in Pennsylvania, travelers climbed twisting mountain grades, their tires straining against gravel and stone. This inconsistency was the reality of early motoring. There was no federal standard, no nationwide plan. Each segment depended on local budgets, local politics, and local pride. Some towns poured resources into paving their part of the highway, eager to attract the traffic and the commerce that came with it. Others did little, leaving their neighbors to shoulder the cost. The result was a patchwork quilt of modernity and antiquity, progress and frustration. Travelers learned to expect the unexpected. A single day could bring smooth cement, then a wooden bridge, then a muddy detour through a farmer's field. Some stretches were lined with bright, new filling stations and diners, while others led through lonely miles without a house in sight. Families carried shovels, ropes, and boards in their cars, ready to dig themselves out of sand or haul the wheels up from a ditch. And yet, this unevenness carried its own strange beauty. Each section reflected the character of the community it passed through. The Lincoln Highway was not a road built by a distant government. It was built piece by people who believed in its promise. County supervisors, local volunteers, prison laborers, and small-town businessmen all left their fingerprints on the road. In this way, the highway was as democratic as it was disorganized. The patchwork nature of the Lincoln Highway also meant that travel demanded patience and resilience. You never quite knew what lay ahead, but that uncertainty made every completed journey all the more meaningful. To have crossed the country on the Lincoln Highway was to have experienced America in all its contrasts, its wealth and poverty, its industry and wilderness, its ambition and its unfinished business for those who braved it. The Lincoln Highway was more than a means of travel. It was a teacher. It reminded Americans that progress did not come all at once and rarely came evenly. It was earned in fits and starts, in patches of concrete laid beside stretches of mud, in communities that embraced the future and others that resisted it. Looking back, the patchwork nature of the road feels almost poetic. It mirrored the nation itself, imperfect, uneven, yet moving forward. Piece by piece, mile by mile, America was knitting itself together, not in a straight, flawless line, but in a rugged human tapestry. And within that imperfection lay the true spirit of the Lincoln Highway. By the mid-1920s, America had outgrown its patchwork of dirt lanes, county byways, and scattered concrete experiments. The dream of coast-to-coast travel had taken root, but it was still a rough and uncertain undertaking. For the nation to move forward, there needed to be something larger, something binding. And in 1926, that shift arrived, the birth of the U.S. numbered highway system. It was a quiet revolution, not as dramatic as the pounding of hammers on new bridges or the pouring of concrete on a seedling mile. Instead, it was a revolution of order, of numbers painted on black and white shields hung along the roadside. For the first time, Americans could follow a standardized grid of highways that stretched across the continent. No longer would a motorist depend solely on hand-painted L's on telephone poles or the goodwill of a local guide. Now there was a map, consistent from New York to California, from Minnesota to Texas. The Lincoln Highway, once a bold experiment in vision and volunteerism, found itself absorbed into this new system. Its long, meandering stretches were divided and reclassified: U.S. Route 30 through much of the Midwest, U.S. 50 further west, and other numbered spurs branching off. What had once been a single, romantic banner across the country now existed only as pieces in a greater puzzle. The dream remained, but the name began to fade. For some, this felt like progress, a triumph of efficiency over nostalgia. After all, uniformity meant safety. A driver could finally set out with a reasonable assurance that the road would be marked, mapped, and maintained. It meant commerce could flow more smoothly, that farmers could bring their produce to city markets, that factories could ship goods without fear of being stranded in a ditch of mud. The numbered highways were arteries for a modern nation, but for others, especially those who had poured sweat and hope into the Lincoln Highway Association, it was bittersweet. The very success of their vision had made them obsolete. The federal government had taken the torch they lit and carried it forward, brighter and steadier, but also stripped of the romance and daring that had once defined the first transcontinental road. In 1928, a final gesture tried to preserve the memory. Thousands of Boy Scouts fanned out along the route, planting small concrete posts every mile or so. Each was marked with a bronze medallion of Abraham Lincoln's profile and the words, "This highway dedicated to Abraham Lincoln." It was a noble attempt to anchor the road in the national memory. Yet within a few short years, even those markers began to crumble or disappear, overshadowed by the more practical signage of the new system. Travelers of the era recall a sense of transition. On one hand, the Lincoln Highway still existed in spirit. You could follow its path if you knew where to look, tracing it across towns that proudly displayed the old signs. But on the other, it was increasingly just another stretch of numbered pavement, folded into a larger order. The intimacy was gone. Where once you felt you were part of a grand experiment, now you were simply one of many moving along a system. And yet, beneath that sense of loss lay a deeper truth. The Lincoln Highway had achieved what it set out to do. It had proven that Americans wanted and needed a road that tied them together. Its patchwork had demonstrated possibility. Its ambition had forced the nation to dream bigger. Without the Lincoln Highway, the numbered highways might never have come so soon, or so boldly. So, as 1926 turned the page, the story of the Lincoln Highway began to slip into shadow. Its name was no longer painted proudly on poles across the land, but its spirit lingered in every white and black shield nailed to a post. Each number, 30, 51, owed something to that forgotten road. And though travelers might not realize it, every time they set out on a well-marked route across America, they were moving along a dream first traced in paint and hope. By the late 1920s, the Lincoln Highway had already begun to fade from the headlines. Its concrete miles and hand-painted L's on telephone poles had shown what was possible. But history has a way of favoring the louder voice, the brighter symbol, the road that captures the imagination of the people. And so, in 1926, as the U.S. highway system took form, another number was given, a simple pair of digits that would soon eclipse the Lincoln Highway. That number was 66. Route 66 quickly became more than a roadway. It became a cultural phenomenon. While the Lincoln Highway had been built on lofty ideals, patriotism, progress, and national unity, Route 66 seemed to pulse with something more visceral. It promised adventure, escape, and reinvention. From Chicago to Los Angeles, it stretched across the plains, deserts, and mountains, offering a more direct path to the golden promise of California. Writers, musicians, and dreamers rushed to it. By the 1930s, John Steinbeck would call it the Mother Road, giving it a title that carried the weight of both hardship and hope. Families fleeing the Dust Bowl followed its cracked pavement west, their Model A's loaded with every belonging they could carry. Migrant workers saw it not just as a road, but as a lifeline, and by the post-war years, Route 66 had been immortalized in songs, television shows, and neon-lit motels, glowing like a beacon of mid-century Americana. Compared to that, the Lincoln Highway seemed old-fashioned, even quaint. It had blazed the trail, but now its identity was lost in a maze of U.S. numbered routes. Its signs were taken down, its association dissolved, and its story slowly slipped into the background of memory. Meanwhile, Route 66 was busy becoming a legend, its very name a kind of shorthand for freedom, youth, and the open road. It wasn't that the Lincoln Highway failed. On the contrary, it succeeded so well that it became invisible. The idea of a coast-to-coast road was no longer revolutionary. It was expected, ordinary. The United States highway system made the extraordinary dream of the Lincoln Highway into an everyday reality. And so the stage was clear for a road like Route 66 to capture the romance Lincoln Highway had pioneered. You can imagine a family in the 1940s pulling into a roadside diner off Route 66, jukebox playing softly in the corner, a neon sign buzzing faintly outside the window. For them, this was the road trip dream, the promise of America rolling beneath their tires. They didn't think of the Lincoln Highway, though its seed had made this moment possible. Instead, they sang along with Nat King Cole's "Get Your Kicks on Route 66, a song that would echo through every jukebox and radio across the nation. The Lincoln Highway Association could not compete with that. Their road was born in an era of visionaries, volunteers, and patched together miles of gravel and mud. It was remembered by engineers, by early motorists, and by the small towns that it saved or sustained. But Route 66 was remembered by everyone. The migrant worker, the soldier returning home, the teenager with a guitar, the family chasing the Pacific sun. And so, by mid-century, the Lincoln Highway lived mostly in shadows. It existed in old maps tucked away in glove compartments, in the fading letters LH carved on a concrete post by a Boy Scout in 1928, in the memories of those who had once dared to cross a continent when such a thing seemed impossible. But in the spotlight, beneath the neon and the bright marquee of American culture, it was Route 66 that shone. Still, if you listen closely when you drive a lonely stretch of road, far from the noise of interstates and the polished travel brochures, you can hear the echo of the Lincoln Highway beneath it all. For before Route 66, before the numbered shields, before the songs and the legends, there was another road built from vision and determination that first taught America how to dream with wheels. If you go looking for the Lincoln Highway today, you will not find a seamless ribbon of pavement bearing its name. You will find fragments, whispers of a once mighty dream scattered across the American landscape. And yet, in those fragments, the spirit of the highway is still alive. The journey begins, fittingly, at the very heart of the nation's hustle, Times Square in New York City. Amidst the neon, the honking taxis, and the towering marquees, there's a small bronze plaque set into the sidewalk. It marks the eastern terminus of the Lincoln Highway. Few passers-by notice it. Tourists hurry past with cameras in hand. Broadway lights pull the eye skyward, and the pulse of the city drowns out its quiet voice. But if you pause, lean down, and brush your hand across its surface, you can almost hear the echo of 1913, when this spot was chosen as the symbolic gateway to the road that would carry Americans westward. From there, the old route meanders into Pennsylvania, winding past Gettysburg, where Lincoln himself once spoke words that still resonate. For travelers retracing the Lincoln Highway, it is a moving intersection of memory, where the Civil War's sacrifices meet the dream of a nation stitched together by road. In Ohio, you can still stay at the Lafayette Hotel in Marietta, once a proud stop for motorists pushing further west. The lobby, with its vintage decor and old photographs, feels like a shrine to another age of travel. In Indiana and Illinois, signs bearing the red, white, and blue L have been lovingly repainted by local enthusiasts. Farmers' fields still roll along the roadside, and in quiet towns, markers stand near courthouses or gas stations that long ago sold their last gallon. Some of the most remarkable stretches are the so-called seedling miles in Nebraska, short experiments of concrete highway poured in the 1910s to prove that durable modern roads could be built. Those same slabs of concrete remain today, weathered but unbroken, a century-old testimony to the boldness of the idea. Drive further west, and you'll find the Ames Monument rising alone on the Wyoming plains. Built of granite, shaped like a pyramid, it honors the railroad men who had dreamed of spanning the continent by rail. Its presence along the Lincoln Highway is fitting, a reminder that this new road was a continuation of the same restless spirit that had once laid steel across the prairies. In Utah, the Lincoln Highway winds through breathtaking desert landscapes where the road feels almost swallowed by silence. Rust-colored mesas catch the late sun, and for miles there may be nothing but the line of pavement and the sound of wind. In Nevada, lonely markers sit beside ghost towns, towns that thrived when the road was new, but now stand as quiet witnesses to its passing. And finally, the road reaches its end in California. The last miles cross the Bay Bridge into San Francisco, where the bust of Abraham Lincoln gazes westward across the Pacific. It is a solemn, dignified reminder of the man whose name gave the road its moral weight. To stand there, looking out at the water, is to realize that the Lincoln Highway was never just about asphalt or direction signs. It was about possibility. It was about the audacity of connecting lives, towns, and dreams from ocean to ocean. Though it is often overlooked, the Lincoln Highway has not disappeared. It lingers in small-town museums, in the painted markers carefully restored by local historical societies, and in the memories of those who set out to drive the whole thing as an act of pilgrimage. To follow it today is to move at a gentler pace, to pass through places bypassed by interstates, to feel the heartbeat of America as it once was. The Lincoln Highway is not gone. It survives in fragments, yes, but together, those fragments form a story still worth telling. A story that whispers across the fields, deserts, and towns it touched. We once dared to dream of a road across America, and here you can still walk upon it. As the Lincoln Highway faded from maps and headlines, it did not truly vanish. Its pavement might have been absorbed into numbered routes, its bold signs painted over or torn down. But the spirit of the road, the daring idea of stringing a nation together by wheels and willpower, remained woven into America's story. To look back at the Lincoln Highway is to be reminded that history is not only written in victories or monuments, but in attempts. The road was not perfect. It was uneven, patched, sometimes little more than a muddy track across farmland. Yet it carried something larger than itself. The promise that ordinary people could reach beyond the boundaries of their town or state, that the world could open up at the turn of an ignition key. Every dream has its flaws. The Lincoln Highway was no exception. It was incomplete, inconsistent, and quickly outdated by the march of technology and federal planning. But perhaps that is why it matters so deeply, because it showed America, in a tangible way, what could be. It proved that roads could cross prairies, mountains, and deserts, and that the automobile could be more than a novelty. It could be a vessel for freedom. When families packed into their Model Ts and rattled westward, they were not just taking a trip. They were stepping into a new identity. Americans who could move where they wished, who could discover distant landscapes firsthand without waiting for a train schedule or a ticket booth. The Lincoln Highway was less about the concrete and more about the courage to believe that such a journey was possible. Memory works in much the same way. We rarely recall every detail with precision. Instead, we hold on to the feeling, the atmosphere, the sense of what it meant to us. The Lincoln Highway is remembered not for every mile of its course, but for the idea it carried across those miles. It was a thread of hope stretched from ocean to ocean, a line that told the country, you are connected, you are capable, you are one. And though Route 66 would later steal the spotlight, immortalized in songs, films, and neon-lit myth, the Lincoln Highway laid the groundwork. It was the seed from which the romance of the American road trip would grow. Without it, perhaps the notion of loading up the family car and chasing the horizon might never have taken root so deeply. Today, when travelers retrace its course, they find fragments. A marker here, a seedling mile there, a small museum in a roadside town. These pieces are not grand, but they are tender, human. They remind us that dreams often leave traces long after their supposed end, and those traces still speak, quietly, to anyone willing to pause and listen. The Lincoln Highway's legacy is not one of smooth perfection, but of honest effort. It is a reminder that progress often begins with a rough sketch, a patchwork attempt, a road that is more mud than concrete. Yet from those humble beginnings, a nation of highways would rise, reshaping how Americans lived, traveled, and dreamed. As the headlights of memory sweep back across that forgotten road, we can see it not as a failure, but as a gift, a promise written on the land that said, "This country is yours to explore." That promise lingers still in the hum of tires on asphalt, in the glow of a diner sign at night, in the quiet thrill of setting out with no destination but the horizon. The Lincoln Highway may not command attention the way it once did, but in every mile of American road trip, in every story told of heading west, it lives on. And perhaps that is the truest legacy, less a monument carved in stone, more a feeling that stirs whenever the road stretches out before us, whispering, "Come see what lies ahead." Picture yourself now at the wheel of an old car on a quiet American highway. The day has faded into night, and the sky above is clear and endless, filled with stars that seem brighter than you remember. The tires hum steadily beneath you, carrying you forward at an unhurried pace. The road stretches ahead in a ribbon of pale gray, bordered by fields and hills that sleep under the moonlight. This is the Lincoln Highway, or what remains of it. It may not look like much today, a forgotten side road, a cracked stretch of concrete, a simple stone marker by the roadside. But in your mind, in your memory, it becomes something larger. It becomes a path not just of asphalt, but of possibility. Imagine the wind slipping in through the open window, cool and gentle, carrying with it the faint scent of cut grass, of farmland, of small towns that have long since closed their doors for the night. Off in the distance, the glow of a diner's neon sign flickers softly, promising coffee, pie, and the warmth of company to anyone who might wander in. But tonight, you don't stop. You simply keep driving, listening to the quiet symphony of engine, wind, and stars as the miles drift past. Think of all the people who once traveled this road. Families on summer adventures, soldiers heading home, dreamers chasing the horizon, and weary workers trying to carve out a better life. Each carried their own story, their own hope, and together they gave this stretch of highway its soul. You are not alone on this road. You are sharing it with all of them, across time, and maybe that is the true gift of the Lincoln Highway. Not that it was the smoothest or the grandest, but that it invited ordinary Americans to step into a larger world. It whispered to them, "You can go farther than you think. The world is waiting for you." Now, as your eyes grow heavier, let the rhythm of the road slow your thoughts. Feel the way the car rocks gently with each curve, the way the stars seem to guide you onward, the way the darkness feels less like an emptiness and more like a comforting blanket. You don't need to reach a destination tonight. The road itself is enough. Its memory carries you. Its history reassures you. And its quiet presence reminds you that sometimes the journey matters more than the arrival. So let the Lincoln Highway fade softly into the night. Let the hum of its story mingle with the sound of the wind outside your own window, or the stillness of your room. Allow yourself to rest, knowing that in remembering this road, you've touched a piece of America's heart, a heart that beats not in monuments, but in simple roads that once carried people forward with hope. And now, dear listener, it is time to rest. Close your eyes. Breathe deeply. Picture the horizon stretched before you, the stars above Wyoming or Nebraska glowing softly, the gentle roll of the car carrying you further into dreams. Before we part tonight, I want to thank you for sharing this journey. Your presence here means everything. If you found comfort in this story, I invite you to leave a comment, share your thoughts or memories, and let us know where you are listening from. Don't forget to subscribe, to like, and to share this channel with others who might need a gentle story to fall asleep to. Here at Sleepytown Radio, we will always keep the porch light on for you, with more stories to guide you through the night. Until then, may your dreams be soft, your rest be deep, and your heart be light. Good night, my friend. Sleep well.